Hello and welcome to the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast. I'm Hugh Fullerton.
I'm Morgan Jeffrey.
And this week we are talking all about regeneration, or specifically regeneration episodes, because we've covered a lot of different stuff on this here Doctor Who podcast over the months. And we've touched on regeneration briefly before, but it's kind of a fun little subgenre in Doctor Who, isn't it? You have Dalek episodes, you have Cybermen episodes, you have exit episodes, but you also have the regeneration episode, which is, for an exiting Doctor. And then, I guess my first question is, would you count a regeneration episode as being the episode in which a Doctor regenerates, or an episode in which we meet the new Doctor? Because that's a very different thing.
Yeah, up for debate. I think what we're talking about here are the exit episodes, the episodes where a Doctor departs, a Doctor's swan song, where the Doctor we have come to know and love departs the show and regenerates into a new form.
Yes. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because back in the classic series, it's easy to forget now because it's always a big deal. We know a Doctor's leaving a long time before they go. There's a lot of build up. There's a lot of, kind of teasing. Like, for example, we knew David Tennant was leaving and he regenerates, a year early in 2008. And you're like, what?
And,
how exciting.
And Peter Capaldi, similarly, like we knew he was on the way out. So they teased that throughout Series 10.
They kept doing it. They were like, yeah, he just regenerates in the next episode. It's like, no, he doesn't.
Yeah.
No, he doesn't.
Well, they worked in like a really poor excuse for him to have a fake regeneration midway through Series 10, purely so that they could put some footage of his hand with the golden glow in the Series 10 trailer just to mess with us.
The thing that I won't get bogged down on that. The thing I remember being particularly annoyed about that because it was a prank to play on Bill to test her allegiance, but Bill wouldn't know what it was.
Yeah. And also, it's we're getting so sidetracked. But also, is it the Lie of the Land? I think it's that episode, and it's never even explained how he fakes a regeneration either. He just sort of goes, "Oh, that was just a trick. Don't worry about it. Carry on."
And she's like, "Why were you going?" And he's like, "It's fine." Anyway, but the thing that is kind of interesting is that's such a big part of the series now, these sort of regeneration things that get built up to. But in the classic series, it wasn't quite the same, was it, Morgan?
No, indeed, Hugh. No, well, it's interesting. I saw what this discussion was spurred on by was I saw a tweet by a Doctor Who fan that was essentially saying something along the lines of, we think now of as you said, regeneration stories as being one of the key parts of Doctor Who, along with Dalek stories, Cybermen stories. But actually, if you think about it, in terms of actual what we would consider to be regeneration stories, there's as many stories featuring the Sontarans in the classic series as there are bona fide regeneration stories, because there are actually fewer, again, in quote marks, regeneration stories than you might think, with many of them just being stories that happen to include a regeneration, which isn't quite the same thing. Now regeneration stories have become an event. They say something that's built to something that's teased way ahead of time, whereas you go right back to the very first story, first regeneration story, the 10th Planet, which now seems incredibly momentous because not only is it William Hartnell's final story as the Doctor, but it's also the introduction of the Cybermen, one of the classic monsters of the series. So it seems perfect. It's like the emergence of the Cybermen was what killed the first Doctor. What a perfect send-off. But actually, that's only with the benefit of hindsight. No one knew the Cybermen were going to become this iconic threat. So with hindsight, it feels like this epic farewell. But actually, it's really just another Doctor Who story, which happens to include a regeneration. It's not particularly about the fact that the Doctor regenerates. In fact, William Hartnell doesn't even appear in 25% of it because he was off sick for one of the 4 episodes. So yeah, in hindsight, it seems like this epic swan song. But actually, despite being a really good story, a really enjoyable story, it's not the grand farewell we sometimes think of it as. And then you've got, following on from that, you've got the War Games, for example, which is Patrick Troughton's final story, which again is often hailed as being this enormous farewell, this epic swan song, mostly because it's 10 episodes long. But the only reason it was 10 episodes long was not through any creative choice, but due to necessity, because there was a 6-part story and a 4-part story that were meant to round off the season. They both fell apart at the last minute, and so Terrence Dicks and Malcolm Hulke had to write a 10-parter purely because they had to fill those 2 slots. So again, it's not really a creative decision to give Patrick Troughton this epic send off, and even then, only 10% of that 10-part story is actually dedicated to the Doctor's regeneration and him being put on trial by the Time Lords being forced to regenerate. So that's the kind of thing I'm driving at, is that often regeneration can, particularly towards the beginning of the series, feel incidental to the stories in which it features, rather than being the kind of the crux of the story.
Definitely. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes with hindsight, like you say, stuff seems more momentous, but also the series itself sometimes goes back and makes them more momentous. Like William Hartnell didn't have that big exit, but then Stephen Moffat wrote him one in Twice Upon a Time, which was also Peter Capaldi's great exit. Like with hindsight, the first Doctor had all these like worries about leaving and, you know, about like moving on to become someone else. It just didn't happen when we thought it happened, if you know what I mean.
It's a classic retcon. And similarly, you know, you have John Pertwee's exit in Planet the Spiders, which you know, that actually is one of the first times where it feels a little like they're designing a story around the fact that it's the Doctor's last story, because you get this one episode of that which is dedicated to a massive chase sequence, essentially just to give John Pertwee one last action showcase. The story deals with ideas of, you know, the Doctor's ego and his pride that he has to overcome to defeat the giant spiders of Metebelis 3. So it's kind of arguably the first true regeneration story. It is actually the first to use the word regeneration, but again, it's kind of hamstrung by the fact that it wasn't supposed to be that way. The third Doctor's era was supposed to end with, or at least season 11 was supposed to end with a story, The Final Game, which was going to be this much talked about final face-off between the Doctor and the Master. The relationship between those two characters was going to be revealed, possibly that they were brothers, and the Master was going to sacrifice himself to save the Doctor. It was going to, which actually thematically feels very appropriate as a kind of rounding off of the third Doctor's era. But those plans were shelved when Roger Delgado passed away. So actually, they were aiming then for quite a grand finale to an era, in much the way as we think of it now with the modern series. But best laid plans and all that. But I think with the classic series, when William Hartnell switched to Patrick Troughton, no one knew if this was going to work. And similarly, you know, they'd done it once, but there was nothing to guarantee that Patrick Troughton switching to John Pertwee, and even John Pertwee to Tom Baker, there was no guarantee that it was going to be a success second or third or fourth time round, right? So now regeneration is seen very much as one of the benefits of Doctor Who. It's great that the show can revitalize and revamp itself every few years, right? Because you can bring in a new actor and potentially gain a whole new bunch of fans. Whereas at the time, in those very early days, possibly they kind of didn't want to make a song and dance about regeneration, because they kind of wanted to say, no, it's fine, it's business as usual, the Doctor has changed, but otherwise the show is exactly the same, which is maybe why the regenerations are slightly more muted. And you know, then, as I say, they're not so much the crux of the story.
It's interesting because I was thinking about this while you were just talking about that, and I was thinking about how, you know, how each modern Doctor has had these big exits. I did think Christopher Eccleston's exit is a bit more like a classic exit, isn't it? It's a story that's happening anyway, and like obviously there is danger there, but his death isn't really teed up. It's kind of like it happens because of a threat in the story, but it's not like Christopher Eccleston spends half the series sort of mooning over his impending doom, like David Tennant ended up doing. David Tennant was dying for almost as long as he was like fine. You know, he spent about 2 years worried about his oncoming death. You know, he will knock 4 times and all that. But yeah, Christopher Eccleston's a funny one because obviously that was at least partially because it wasn't originally intended for him to leave.
Right, exactly.
Which was maybe a little bit more like the classic series, a little bit more seat of the pants. But I think it's kind of, again, it works. I mean, it kind of works because we like it. And with the benefit of hindsight, again, it works, and you think, "Oh, right, that's fine." But
I think it's interesting with we have speaking very broadly, but you have this idea of the classic series regeneration story, which is, as you say, it's just a story that's happening anyway, and it so happens that at the end of it, the Doctor regenerates. And then you have the modern sort of new series version where the crux of the story is that the Doctor is regenerating, and it's all building to that. It's all building to that. And I'm not necessarily saying that like one is better than the other, because although it seems like it might be more dramatically satisfying to have this story building and building and building, and then the payoff is this huge regeneration. Actually, there is something in the storytelling that's quite interesting, in this idea that this is like any other adventure for the Doctor. It just so happens that this is the one where he trips up. You know,
I quite like that idea. Like, I know it's not, I see a lot of fans say this, and it's one of those things that just isn't possible because of the way the series is made and with the kind of attention it has. But people are always like, wouldn't it be great to have a surprise regeneration? Wouldn't it be great where just in the middle of, or mid-series regeneration or something like that? And there have been some rumours to that effect with the next series of Doctor Who with Jodie Whittaker, which I think is wishful thinking on the part of people who don't like Jodie Whittaker, mostly. But you never know. But anyway, yeah, it's something that has never been done, a surprise regeneration, really. But it is something that you kind of like the idea of, you know, and like you say, of the risk. Every week the Doctor almost dies, and why wouldn't it just happen, you know, the time that he's shot? I mean, I kind of liked the Doctor being shot by some random Dalek in, you know, in the Stolen Earth, into Journey's End, and then that making him regenerate like mid-adventure. Part of me was like gutted that David Tennant then didn't regenerate, because I really liked David Tennant, but I was like, how cool would that have been to have to deal with that right in the middle of something?
Yeah, no, exactly. And regeneration is never a surprise to the viewer, but it's always a surprise to the Doctor.
Yeah.
So there's nothing to say that something couldn't just come totally out of left field, and that's what causes the Doctor's regeneration, as opposed to something that, because that's another thing in the new series, he almost always sees his regeneration coming, right? So actually not in the again, not in the Christopher Eccleston exit. It very much is something that he takes on that decision to absorb the time vortex into himself to save Rose. But it's kind of like a split decision. Whereas the 10th Doctor, his doom is long foretold. The 11th Doctor, you know, he's told he has to go to Trenzalore, and that's where he'll meet his end. 12th Doctor is fighting his regeneration for the longest time. So that, you know, they always know it's coming. So it's lacking that surprise factor, and you kind of miss the simplicity slightly of stories like Caves of Androzani, which is Peter Davison's final story, where it is like an adventure much like any other. It just so happens that on that occasion he literally touches something he shouldn't, and then dies of poisoning. Although he sacrifices his life for a woman he barely knows, in the form of Perry, which I've always liked. At least if you go by TV continuity and avoid the reams of adventures they're supposed to have had in books and Big Finish and so on. Which I like those stories, but I do think it robs that story of some of its poetry, that the Doctor sacrifices his life for, as I say, someone he barely knows. And again, there is in some ways it can be dramatically unsatisfying, the sort of classic series form of regeneration story, in the sense that there isn't that grand build up. But on the other hand, there is a simplicity to the regeneration stories of old. You can have the Doctor giving his life to save one person, much like actually Night of the Doctor, the Paul McGann minisode. I quite like that. Was almost like a harkening back to the classic series, which I guess makes sense, because McGann is arguably the last classic series Doctor. The fact that the Doctor does just give his life to save one woman, I quite like that. Whereas now he always has to go out as part of some galactic universal cataclysm across all of time and space, and he's saving all, it's the end of time, it's the end of time and space, it's the end of the universe. Although, having said that, end of time does boil that down again quite nicely to, he does actually, having said all that, he does give up his life just to save Wilf, having already saved the universe. So that's a nice balance of kind of the grandiose and the more personal.
Well, that's something Rusty Davies had always had planned. Like, he sort of said for years, I know exactly how David Tennant's Doctor is going to go. And it wasn't that he knew that, the Master will come back and it'll be a sort of floating skull. It was more like, he said he'll solve the big thing, and then he'll sacrifice himself for a little thing. I mean, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know how you feel about this. I did sometimes feel like the modern series can milk it a little bit as well, because it's obviously like, you're losing a beloved Doctor. People very fond of the character. They're like a kind of like a James Bond figure. They're like an ambassador for the brand. And, fans are very attached to the actors. So you kind of want to give them their due, and kind of, it is a big deal for fans. You want to make it a big deal for the show as well. But then you also, have a point where, like I said, with David Tennant, his entire last year of specials was all about, you're dying. Hey, you're going to die soon. Okay, guess what? Death's on its way. Hey, your song's almost over. Hey, you know what I said about you dying? You're still going to die. Like, just sort of did that. And then with Matt Smith, obviously, it was kind of, there'd been hints at him dying and then not dying before, with the whole River Song astronaut thing, whatever that was about. But then obviously, like you say, the Trenzalore was waiting for him, and then he had the biggest regeneration ever, to the point that he used the regeneration energy to blow up spaceships. You know,
Yeah.
so I feel like there is sometimes, like I say, a tendency to milk it slightly. Like weirdly, Peter Capaldi's one was slightly different in that he kind of just pauses, he just hits pause and just has an extra little adventure and then regenerates.
Which I do have some sympathy for, because that was not the original intention, right?
No.
It was definitely Stephen Moffat's intention that he would go out with the Doctor falls, which is fine, is a perfectly self-contained regeneration story. The Doctor faces off against the Master and Missy. Yeah, great. He saves Bill, and then Stephen Moffat had to do one more, and so it's kind of like okay, so he did have to. Yeah, the Doctor literally just had to put his regeneration on pause for a whole hour or more. But that's kind of down to necessity rather than any creative choice. Although having said that, I really like Twice Upon a Time. And yeah, going back to that Matt Smith regeneration, that's a funny one, because I know the sneeze regeneration, as it's often called, gets a lot of flack, where the 11th Doctor just suddenly in a flash turns into the 12th Doctor. But I always like that, because you previously had David Tennant, who he explodes in a burst of regeneration energy and destroys the whole TARDIS. Just before, in that very same story, as you say, you'd had the 11th Doctor releasing all these bursts of regeneration energy and swatting down spaceships. So I quite like that when it finally happened, it was just kind of like blink and you'll miss him, he's gone. So I think there's definitely something to be said for the underplaying of a regeneration and making it a slightly more small moment.
I think that was a good move. Like it undercuts slightly the thing I talked about before, where it's the hugest thing ever. Like they kind of have a bit of a double hit with Matt Smith regeneration, in that you have the like hugely epic momentous one, and then you have the little, I'll do a nice little speech and then go. I mean, I did also kind of like, this is a very specific thing, but I've always found it a bit of a shame that they really regulated how regenerations look in the new series, because they're all different more or less in the classic series. And then since 2005, it has been the glowing energy, or slightly more colourful energy if you're the Master. And that's been, I kind of like that you kind of know what it looks like or whatever. But my sort of real nerdy, everything's got to fit together thing is like, why was it different the other? Why did one of the times he get plastered up with plaster of Paris? And why was he like kind of Frankenstein monstering into Paul McGann the other time? And then also, I'm kind of like, I kind of wish there could have been slightly different creative takes on it. I get why you want to make it look uniform, so you can so it's very clear what's happening. Because I think even a casual viewer who watched Peter Capaldi's regeneration might remember David Tennant's and would kind of like be like, oh yeah, I know what's happening here. But I'm also like, it would have been cool to use kind of like special effects to do it in a slightly different way. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's now sort of this dedication to consistency. So it's seen as more important that they match, or roughly match the way in which Christopher Eccleston regenerated when later Doctors regenerate. And whereas in the classic series, they weren't as concerned about that internal consistency. They were just like, what's a cool way, or just the easiest and cheapest way, in some cases, that we can shift from one actor to another. But no, I think it's sort of like, it does limit slightly. I mean, some fans have gone back and applied the sort of gold explosion of energy effect to classic regeneration sequences in an attempt to make it all fit, and that's what it actually should have looked like. But no, I agree. I think it's fun that that there was some variation, and it does slightly limit. As much as I like that current regeneration effect, I wouldn't be mad if it changed, because it does slightly limit the creativity, I think, of future creative teams if they want to do something different with a regeneration and approach it visually in a different way. Because there are some that in the classic series, like the John Pertwee to Tom Baker regeneration is just a straight fade, which is quite dull. But there's something exciting about the fourth Doctor to fifth Doctor regeneration, where he becomes the Watcher halfway through, and there's as you say, the kind of plaster of Paris face. Or the seventh Doctor to the eighth Doctor, where you have a gurning Sylvester McCoy kind of CGI morph into Paul McGann. And there's lightning going on for some reason. Like it's fun that there's a different creative approach to each regeneration.
I mean, one thing I would say as a pointer for whether those regenerations will ever change is, I may need to be stood corrected on this. I think as of Twice Upon a Time, the same person pretty much had done all the regenerations. It was the same guy. So it was the Mill, then later the Milk, who did the special effects, and it was pretty. I think they said it was the same guy had done all the regenerations in modern Doctor Who. It was kind of his specialty. He was the regeneration guy, which was a pretty cool specialty. It was, or he'd done most of them anyway. But as of Jodie Whittaker's first series, a different team does the special effects. So it's possible that if and when Jodie Whittaker leaves the role, they will go for something different. They might decide.
She'll just disappear in a puff of smoke.
Yeah.
And then a new Doctor will emerge, or something like that, or she'll tear her face off, sort of Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible style. Like,
and it'll be Chris Marshall underneath.
Well, that's kind of bringing it back to what we were talking about the classic series style of regeneration stories, which are sort of more small scale, and regeneration is almost incidental to them. And then the new series style, which up till this point has been very grandiose, and it's all been building to that moment of regeneration. When it is time for Jodie to go, how would you like them to approach her regeneration? Would you do you think they should keep the kind of big epic storytelling, or should they go for something more personal, or should they kind of end of time styles, try and strike a balance somewhere in between? Or?
I think it's an excellent question, because stylistically, I like the idea of it being more of a little thing, a sort of surprising thing, even like, a mid-series thing or whatever. However, I feel like that would look like an insult, if you know what I mean. Like if you make it, it doesn't, she's just gone, whatever. Like if you make it seem like the show doesn't care that this Doctor has gone, it sort of suggests the show doesn't matter. This Doctor doesn't matter to the show, that she shouldn't matter to the fans. And I get that, people have different opinions about which Doctors they like and stuff, but I think it would be a bit unfair to her as an actor and her version of character to not give her a big send off now that that's become the norm, if you know what I mean.
Well, like you say, it's now, at least it's seen as sort of one last chance to give that actor a chance to show what they can really do. And that does go back actually to Planet of the Spiders, when it really showed what John Pertwee could do. He could race that Hoomobile like nobody's business. But with the more modern Doctors, it's more of kind of like an emotional showcase. It kind of has to hit all the beats, and they have to say all their catchphrases and all that kind of stuff, which is fun. It's kind of like a fond farewell, as you said, to their Doctor. So I know what you mean. I wonder if there's a way of doing a story that feels both epic and personal at the same time, because I would like to see them try something different. Like I think it'd be interesting to see a regeneration story that's not entirely about saving the multiverse, and if they could do something different. But I agree, it still has to be a grand showcase. It still has to be epic in its own way.
Okay, Jordan, here's my take. I've assembled it on the spot. Is that during the episode, the Doctor meets the next Doctor that she's going to turn into, and like as a surprise, like in one of the first scene, and they need her help, and then they have to work together over the course of the episode. So you meet this next Doctor through her Doctor's eyes, and you're kind of a little bit like when Matt Smith turned up in Deep Breath, but like the whole time. And then so it's kind of not a massive story, but it's kind of like, and this Doctor maybe can't remember how he or she turned into this one, and you basically spend the whole thing of them sort of fighting the threat together and getting it together, and then at the end stuff happens, and she does become that Doctor. And that's my way of doing it, because then you kind of get it's more like a literal handing over the torch moment, and technically there's no reason you couldn't do it.
There's no reason you couldn't do it. It would definitely be a different approach, something they've never done. It would hit another of those sort of tenets of Doctor Who, the multi-Doctor story.
The downside would maybe be that it kind of undercuts, this is the new person, because the old person's still hanging around a bit. Do you know what I mean? But I'm sure we can make it work. We'll write in. I mean,
some fans are still demanding that Jo Martin be the next Doctor, and that they somehow find a way to make that happen. So that if that did ever happen, personally, I'm not sure it will, but if it did ever happen, that they've kind of already telegraphed her Doctor. She's been seen. It's maybe Chris Chibnall's playing the long game. Maybe this is we were talking about the very slow build up to a regeneration story. Maybe Jo Martin is the next Doctor, and it's already from Fugitive of the Jadoon onwards. We're slowly building to this momentous exit for Jodie Whittaker. Who knows? That
would be a great twist if Jodie Whittaker just turned into Jo Martin in an episode, and then it was like psych. She was the next one after all.
Timeless child, psych.
Yeah, not real. Don't know who. I don't know. I mean, I think there's definitely different ways of doing it. I guess the trick is to find something that's satisfying but also doesn't feel overdone. And I think now that, like we say, now that you know, once upon a time you could get away with something a bit more minor and just sort of move along. I feel like you kind of need to do something now. I feel like they did try and do the kind of balance thing with Twice Upon a Time, because that's kind of a small story. Nothing actually really happens in that.
Yeah.
It's very kind of small. There's not really a threat, but it's kind of momentous by the fact of having the first Doctor there. And I feel like you can find something like that to do.
Yeah, well, the reason that works nicely is again, going back to the reasons it existed in the first place, which Stephen Moffat was probably like, oh, I've got to do another story. I've done my big send off for that Doctor, and for me, I've done the big finale, and then he has to do one more. And so what Twice Upon a Time becomes is this sort of the epilogue to that era. It becomes the coda, becomes this emotional coda to the era, not really the grand finale. And I think I wrote something about at the time along the lines of, it doesn't really need to exist, but I'm glad it does.
Yes.
Because it's kind of like, it's no deep breath pun here, but it is kind of like the exhaling after the Doctor falls, and it does give you the opportunity to have a slightly more thoughtful, emotional exit for the Doctor that's not just pure whiz bang, and that was something that emerged purely out of necessity. But actually, I agree. I think it works quite nicely.
I mean, so much of great Doctor Who stuff emerges out of necessity, I think. Like Regeneration itself emerged from necessity. So it all ties together.
Bring it all back. Bring it all back.
But what do you think, loyal listeners? What is your favourite Regeneration story? And do you think it's better to go big or go home? Not sure what that means, but, work it out in the comments. Thanks for listening. We've got loads of Doctor Who content on radiotimes.com as per usual. You can find it by looking it up. Go and have a look, or just by following us on Twitter and Facebook, because we tweet about things quite a lot. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another edition of the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast. But until then, I've been Hugh Fullerton.
And I've been Morgan Jeffrey, unless I've regenerated, which I don't think I have.
Yeah, if Morgan comes back with a different accent next week, you'll know it's either he's regenerated or he's just trying to do a Stephen Moffat impression again. Anyway, thanks for listening, and goodbye.